C-SPAN 3.
Next on the presidency, Edward Linenthal, Timothy Naftali, and Jeffrey Engel discuss how we remember historic events, our collective memory, and how John F. Kennedy's legacy has altered since his death in November of 1963. This event was hosted by the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you indeed for that fine and kind introduction, and welcome to you all. And indeed, let me offer my immediate thanks to the Sixth Floor Museum. It's been wonderful to partner with you, and the partnership between they and SMU, Southern Methodist University, has really been wonderful to behold as someone who's new to town, and I look forward to much, much more coming forward in the future. Now, over the course of the year, as Jim just mentioned, we and our friends throughout the city are intending to essentially join together to study and to discuss, and ultimately we hope to understand a little bit better the events of November of 1963, not only for what happened then, but I think more to the point for our panel tonight, what those events continue to mean for our city and for our country and for the world as the years go by. Now, in a moment, I will introduce my fellow panelists, distinguished indeed. But first, I thought I would start by asking, and then to a brief extent answering, the question of why we're here. The question in particular of what are the politics of memory? What is history and memory? And it's of course prudent to ask this question because we gather mere yards from an epically important historical site. Mere yards, of course, from where a young president met his untimely demise, and mere yards by consequence of where the entire world took a sudden and unexpected turn. We gather, therefore, at a site that's verily saturated with memories, saturated with historical memories at that. Now, of course, those alive at the time of November of 1963 can all remember full well what they were doing the moment they heard that the president was shot, what they were thinking, what their actions were, what their immediate emotional response was. But those born since then, myself included, I would contend have memories of November of 1963 as well. Because we've all viewed the pictures, seen the movies, heard the stories so many times, time and again, that we essentially know Dealey Plaza, we know the Sixth Floor, we know the Texas Book Depository, even if we have never been there. These are ingrained in our collective memory, in the memory of our souls, of our country. And therefore we gather here tonight to discuss not only how memories are forged, but also how they change collectively for all of us over time. Now, to take a step back, I contend often and frequently that there are essentially three basic reasons why one might choose and be interested in studying history. The first is because it's basically the best reality show out there, the study of history. Now, the second is that history offers, I think, the best guide that we have for making decisions going forward in our own lives and into the future. We, of course, can study the past and learn from the mistakes that were made and the successes that were achieved. Now, this is not to suggest that we're not going to repeat those mistakes, but at least if we study those mistakes and those successes, we'll be a little bit less surprised when we do the same thing as those before us. But in a sense, it's the third reason for studying history that I think brings us here tonight. We study history because history tells us who we are. It tells us what we cherish. It tells us what our values are. It tells us essentially what brings us all together as a people and as a nation. Now, no less an authority than President Abraham Lincoln made this point most eloquently, I think, when he described the shared values that bind a nation as the mystic cords of memory. These are what bind us together, he said. These are what make us into a people. Now, this is not as easy a process as you might initially think, because while past events, one might argue, are set in stone, past interpretations are not. Simply put, what matters to one generation is not by any means what matters to the next, and the next, and the next after that. One generation's heroes, one generation's meaningful sites, one generation's important defining stories might be different from those that came before and before them. Collective memory, then, the memory of a nation, is of course a fluid, therefore, and dynamic process. It's rife as we'll I'm sure discuss tonight, with growing pains, because our understanding of the past tells us really more about ourselves and what we value than necessarily what happened. For I would contend that when we hold up history as a beacon of light that we might use to guide our way into the future, what we're really illuminating is ourselves. This and more is what we mean by the discussion of history and the politics of memory, this evolution and changing of meaning over time. And this is what we're going to discuss tonight. And I would put to you that we simply could not have found two better guides for our intellectual journey this evening into this terrain. Tonight we're joined by two of the nation's leading historians. Each resides at the very top of the historical profession. But each is also an expert not only in the past, but in how the past is remembered. To my immediate left is Professor Ed Linenthal from Indiana University, where he edits the Journal of American History. This is, by most accounts, the single most influential journal in the field of academic history today. Now, by extension, therefore, Professor Linenthal is clearly among the most powerful, the most wise, the most handsome, and influential historians working in the field today, and I would encourage him to remember that should I ever submit a manuscript.
It's all true.
Yes.
All true.
And in addition to this service to the profession, he is also a noted scholar of American culture, religion, and politics, particularly expert in how Americans choose to understand and define their historic sites, battlefields, and collective points of memory. Sitting to his left is Tim Naftali, a noted diplomatic historian. He is author, to my mind, of the single best book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, a book that not only looks at Washington's approach to this epic crisis, but also the thoughts of policymakers in Havana, in Moscow, and around the world. He is currently completing what I think is going to be a tremendously influential biography of President John F. Kennedy, which should be out later this year. He also served for many years as director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum, which means, of course, that he is no stranger to the very arguments that can arise over history and the problems that can arise when trying to bring academic history into the popular and political realms. Gentlemen, welcome to Dallas.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Now, in a few minutes, we're going to take questions from the audience. And in fact, I believe there are cards that are being circulated throughout. And if you have a question, please take a moment to hand those to one of our assistants and volunteers. And we'll make sure your voice gets heard in this process throughout the evening as well, when that means. But let me begin by asking a question, I think, of you, Professor Linenthal. I thought I'd ask you, before we move on to a perspective on President Kennedy, to give us a sense of what actually is the evolution of historical memory. How does a nation come to understand what it values, and how does a nation move forward with that knowledge?
In 20 words or less.
No small question. Yeah, I understand.
It's a difficult thing to focus on. Just one example of that. I think about history as an enduring argument, as something fluid. We revise history all the time. We bring new perspectives to it. We ask new questions about it. We have new places from which to remember. Revisionism has become such a accusatory term when we think about historians, isn't it? Well, he's a revisionist. Oh, my goodness. Well, we don't say that about our doctors, do we? When we go and they don't put leeches on our arm anymore. Oh, my God, it's a medical revisionist, for heaven's sakes. That this is a living, organic process. I've had the opportunity, really been blessed with the chance to write about biographies of historic sites. And when we look at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, we walk in and see the finished product, but what is the tumultuous history that has brought that about? What are the contested issues that people have had to deal with? How are voices of commemoration and voices of history blended together or conflicting? My first trip here many years ago on the anniversary, it was fascinating to me to watch. There was a conference in town, I guess, of conspiracy theorists, and they had name tags on, and they were on the plaza, and it was fascinating to watch them remap imaginatively the plaza in their mind. It didn't matter. I didn't have any dog in the fight of what they were saying, but going about that was fascinating to me. Watching the evolution of this site, and Stephen Fagan, who's associate curator here and directs the oral history program here, has a wonderful book coming out from the University of Oklahoma Press in June on the biography of this place. How has this place lived in Dallas? The early days, not all unlike the early days of Ford's Theater. Let's get rid of it. It's a site of shame. It's toxic. We don't want to remember. Let's just remember the good. A kind of, a chamber of commerce, progressive narrative of history that gradually becomes more mature as we seek to engage and deal with those difficult kinds of historic sites. And we do that, I think, as well as anybody, for all of the ways in which Americans, and sometimes rightly so, are chided for not knowing their history. Think of if you were, anthropologist from Mars and came down to the historic landscape of the United States in 1950 and then came back today. What kind of expansion would you see? You would see that, whoa, ordinary folks, even women, believe it or not, were agents of American history. That African Americans and Native Americans and others were agents of history. That we now remember even these places of tremendous sorrow, as we had done at Ford's Theater, now we do here. Even now we remember sites of lynching. That we engage these indigestible narratives. So one of the things that I look at when I write as a student of these places is, what are the preferred narratives that are there? How do we either use those as an evasion of digging deeper? What are the indigestible narratives that we're willing to confront? So I see this as an organic and ongoing process. History not as a set of frozen things in time, but a constant re-examination with every generation bringing a new set of questions. If we would all be here, well, I will, but none of you will, for the 100th anniversary, for example, it would be stunning to look at what's remembered then. If I see, this is the problem when you get academics. You get asked one question, and I'm doing a dissertation here, but final comment. I've been thinking about the power of 50th anniversaries that I've been able to write about at Gettysburg, at the Little Bighorn, at Pearl Harbor, at the Holocaust Museum, the 50th anniversary of the Holocaust when it was open. But at the Little Bighorn, the 50th anniversary, these times of intense remembering, but also intense forgetting at the same time, was all about the sacrifice of Custer and the men of the 7th. Native Americans played only a role as a kind of skilled, albeit brave but barbaric enemies brought to, as one speech said, ways of pleasantness by the power of American civilization. That was the 50th. What happens at the 100th? At the 100th, you have protests at the Little Bighorn, but the official National Park Service brochure that's in play at the 100th in 1976 talks about the battle not as a sacrifice of Custer and the men of the 7th, but the last armed efforts of the Northern Plains Indians to preserve their ancestral way of life. Now, to do history well, in my opinion, it's not to take one or the other. It's not to turn Custer into the saint of Errol Flynn, they died with their boots on, nor the martial megalomaniac of Little Big Man. Right? It's Custer and his men of the 7th died. Other groups of Americans shed their blood here as well. And it's that full story that enriches who we are as a people. So I'm finally done.
No, it's great. But let me, before I turn to Tim, let me push you on just one point, because we're, of course, up against the 50th anniversary of the events here. What is it about 50? Is it simply that the youngest observers are perhaps not going to be around?
I think that's a large part of it, that the founding generation, those who were adults who were seared by this, this is in many ways the last time they get to put that eyewitness imprint on the site, to say these are the narratives that count, and to remember them from those PowerPoints that count.
Interesting. So, Tim, you're telling us a new revisionist history of JFK. It's been 50 years. So what should we be thinking about JFK that people at the time weren't necessarily aware of?
Well, Jeff, the first thing is that when you think about the legacy of November 22nd, there are so many levels to that. But I thought I'd mention something to you that we don't often think about, which is the effect on the historical evaluation of JFK by the fact by the way in which he died. He didn't write a memoir. He would have written a memoir. He had a taping system put in place so that he could have the details he would need for a memoir. Now, he wouldn't have written it by himself, but he would have dictated a lot of it because that was his wont. Now, why would a memoir have made a difference for Kennedy? Well, some presidents are ideological. Their activities, their actions are predictable. John F. Kennedy was proudly non-ideological. In a meeting with the French Minister of Culture in 1962, he explained to him that the ideology is over. The ideological wars are done. Leadership now is a matter of engineering. Growth rates, deficits, the ideological questions are over. Kennedy was not ideological at all. He was a pragmatist. And when you're dealing with a pragmatist, it means that they could take various approaches to a problem. Well, what does that mean for Kennedy? Kennedy left a lot of unanswered questions in 1963. Questions that would roil this country over the course of the 60s and 70s. And very smart and honest people would deeply disagree over which path John F. Kennedy would have taken had he lived. Had John F. Kennedy been an ideologue, it would have been predictable. You could have said, well, he would have acted in 1964 in Vietnam the way he acted in 1961. But he wasn't that type of leader. What has happened, I think, in the study of Kennedy is that the tentativeness of this man, the humanity of this president was lost. The martyred president became a much more decisive portrait than he actually was in life. I'm not critical of him for not being decisive because the problems he faced were really difficult. And if you rush to judgment, you usually make a mistake. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the best example. If John F. Kennedy had done what he really wanted to do the day he found out about the missiles, he would have launched an airstrike. We now know that would have been a huge mistake. First of all, the Soviets had a lot more on the island of Cuba than the American government ever knew. But also, as it turned out, there was a peaceful diplomatic approach, which in the long term was in the interest of both the United States, the Soviet Union, and the world. So by not acting on his first impulse, John Kennedy did the right thing. And John Kennedy was not the type of leader to act on his first impulse. The way in which he died, though, meant that he could never explain himself to us. The way in which he died, the suddenness, meant that people around him decided to show elements of Kennedy that they liked and to downplay those elements of Kennedy that they didn't agree with. And he, like a lot of smart, capable, self-confident leaders, he had a group of people around him he didn't always agree with. One of the lessons I've learned in writing this book on Kennedy and what kind of president he was is I've discovered the extent to which he disagreed with his advisors. Who the president is matters. You can take the same group of advisors and change the president and come out with different outcomes. And if you want to run that experiment historically, look at John F. Kennedy and look at Lyndon Johnson. Johnson and Kennedy had pretty much the same advisors in foreign policy, but I will at least argue that I'm convinced the outcomes were quite different. So the way in which the president died, the fact that he dies in office, the fact that he dies as the victim of a violent crime, we don't talk about it because it's painful, but he wasn't just, I mean, this was a very violent act. For many reasons, that discouraged the kind of analysis of the presidency that had he either been not reelected in 1964 or retired in 1969, he would have come under a different light of scrutiny. Now, why does this matter? It doesn't just matter because I'm writing a book about him. It matters because John F. Kennedy mattered for Americans in a way most presidents haven't. let's sit back for a moment and think about presidents who've been part of our popular culture, who've really had an effect on our popular culture. I can think of three. I think Ronald Reagan is one. I think that Richard Nixon is another. I know something about him, but I'm going to try not to talk about him tonight. And John F. Kennedy. I'm not saying John F. Kennedy wouldn't have had the hold that he had on the popular imagination had he not been assassinated. I think he was, because of his charm, because of his youth, he had command of this country, but he wasn't as popular as people think in 1963. He also wasn't ideological. There was no Kennedyism. There wouldn't have been a Kennedy school of running government. I don't mean the Kennedy School at Harvard. I meant an ideological approach to it. Kennedy is seared into our popular imagination because of the way in which he died. So it puts him on, if you will, our virtual Mount Rushmore for the 20th century. That meant that figuring out who this man was became very important for the United States. And it shouldn't be a surprise to you that there's been a bipartisan desire over time to embrace him. In fact, in the last election, the Republicans reminded Americans of how John Kennedy supported tax cuts. At one point in the Cold War, John Kennedy was being touted as a great Cold Warrior, and in the 1970s, he was being touted as somebody who was skeptical of the Cold War. The reason for that is that the evidence was disparate, and the man was tentative at some moments in his career. So he didn't give I think he left the evidence to make up our minds, but it's taken a long time to find it out. I think that is an aspect to the effect of the assassination that is also not considered. The other is that because he died, the taping system, which might never have been made public, was preserved. It's not clear that John F. Kennedy wouldn't have destroyed his tapes. He had the right to. It's only with Nixon the tapes become public property. He could have easily destroyed them, but he didn't. He couldn't. And so they remain as the best example of the essence of Kennedy's decision-making. The tentativeness, which, by the way, I don't use in a pejorative sense, is right there for you to glean. Most people, when they think of the tapes, they think of the 25, 30 hours of Cuban Missile Crisis conversations. He left us 260 hours. He starts taping in the summer of 1962, and he's taping until just before he leaves to the West Coast, just before he leaves for Dallas. So we have a remarkable portrait, an oral portrait of this president, and it's taken years for us to actually make sense of it. So when you think about the legacy of Dallas, of course it robs us of at least the last year of the Kennedy administration, if not another 5 years. But it also leaves an enigma which will have political implications for the country to this moment. And so think not only about the evolution of Dallas and what it means, but think of the evolution of JFK, because both, I believe, are linked.
Well, let me push you on this issue a little bit, if I may. We invited you down to Dallas, after all. If Kennedy was, in fact, the non-ideologue that you argue, and I think you've made a compelling case that that is so, why did he generate such ideological vitriol and fervor against him, far beyond what we've seen in other presidents?
I want to make 2 points about that. The first thing is, in working on this project, I've talked to a lot of Kennedy people, and they have this animosity towards Dallas, which I find intellectually intriguing. Emotionally, I understand it. But I find it intellectually intriguing because the Dallas that a liberal Northeasterner would dislike in 1963 didn't kill Kennedy. Kennedy was not killed by a right-wing kook. He was killed by a left-wing kook. That's what I believe. We could get into that debate later, and that's probably another con. But let me put it this way. I tried to follow every single conspiracy theory, and none of them get me to Dallas. And I'm left quite convinced that it was Lee Harvey Oswald who did it alone. Well, here's my point. Nevertheless, even though the trigger man is of the left, Dallas gets this reputation as killing a president. Well, this man wasn't even from Dallas. But anyway, I put that. Now, the other point is that I think Kennedy was very secretive, and he didn't want everybody to know what he believed. And he was much more skeptical of the Cold War than he let on. And it's only the American University speech of 1963 where he lets it out. The evidence is overwhelming that he could have made that speech in his mind in 1961, but politically he couldn't. Which gets to your question about why the right wing disliked him so much. He was saying things about the Soviets which Americans for at that point 15 years had been told not to believe. John Kennedy is the first one to say the Soviets, later on Sting would say this, would sing it in a song, but the Soviets love their children too. That the Soviets are human beings. They're not automatons. They're not... and Kennedy was willing to say that. He was willing to sign an arms control agreement, a test ban treaty with the Soviets. He was basically willing to say that the Soviets were not the ideological menace that many, not just on the far right, mind you, but many in the center-right had grown up believing. His willingness to say that was threatening, I think, to many people. That's one. The other, I'm afraid, is religion. I have a feeling that some of that is the old tension between Protestants and Catholics. I'm not sure of it, but I suspect some of it's religion. But one of the things about Kennedy is that he knew about the risks that his ideas posed for him politically. So if you want to be critical of him, you can be critical of him for not taking greater political risks. But he was very calculated. He took those risks when he thought he could, and in 1963 he started taking risks, and sadly that's when he leaves us.
Well, let me ask a question for both of you, and I'd love to hear each of you respond and hopefully argue, that one might think about Kennedy's legacy and the evolution of Kennedy's legacy, both in the immediate aftermath, as you described, and also moving forward. And if we were to look and try to rank what it is that Kennedy ultimately left behind, I think one could make the argument that what Kennedy ultimately left behind was the Great Society and Vietnam. Two things in which he, in fact, played very little part. One can make the argument that President Johnson does not get the full extent of the Great Society legislation without being able to use the image, as you describe, of the martyred president on his behalf. And simultaneously, as I think you alluded to, one can make the argument that one does not move down the path towards Vietnam in the same way had Kennedy been the president. Consequently, the two greatest impacts, perhaps, of the 60s really are legacies of Kennedy, but they're not results of Kennedy. They're not something that Kennedy did. They're more what Kennedy did with his absence. Discuss.
Legacies. Tim knows this story as well as anyone, but I mentioned that 50ths are a time for intense remembering and intense forgetting at the same time. And last year, it seemed to me we didn't appreciate enough the partnership of John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The further away we get, the scarier it becomes. And it's hard for me to imagine anyone else sitting in either one of those chairs where we are all still here today, knowing what we know about tactical nuclear weapons and the complete failure of Americans to know what was going on the island, and against civilian advisors, military advisors, the fact that Kennedy and Khrushchev, who reached out, were able, even if their wrong-headed policies brought them there, it seems to me that that's the legacy that trumps all of the rest of them. I think there are some legacies that are very difficult to quantify in any way. We know by the 60s already